For 2,500 years, historians dismissed an ancient Greek writer as wrong. Then DNA proved he was right all along. Before Rome ruled Italy, before the Republic, before the Empire, before the legions and the aqueducts, and the roads that would eventually connect 3 continents, there was a civilization that ruled the peninsula. The Etruscans built cities with sophisticated sewer systems centuries before Rome had paved streets. They developed an alphabet that the Romans adopted and adapted into Latin script, the same script used to write these words. They invented the architectural arch that Roman engineers would later perfect. They held gladiatorial combats and chariot races that Rome would inherit and make infamous. Etruscan religious practices, particularly their elaborate systems of divination through the examination of animal entrails and the reading of lightning patterns, were absorbed wholesale into Roman state religion and persisted for centuries after the Etruscan civilization itself had ceased to exist as an independent political force. In nearly every domain of civilization, engineering, religion, art, governance, Rome learned from the Etruscans before it conquered them, and then Rome erased them. Not through genocide, but through something almost as effective: absorption, assimilation, and a centuries-long process of cultural overwriting that left the Etruscan language extinct, the Etruscan political identity dissolved, and the Etruscan origin story reduced to a footnote in Roman history written by the very people who had subsumed them. By the time the Roman Empire reached its height, Etruria was simply a region of Italy. The people who had built one of the ancient world's great civilizations had become Romans, indistinguishable in the historical record from the conquerors who had absorbed them. What remained was a mystery. The Etruscan language, partially preserved in inscriptions on tombs, pottery, and religious artifacts, is unlike any other language in Europe. It is not Indo-European. It bears no clear relationship to Latin, to Greek, to any of the Celtic or Germanic languages that surrounded it. Like Basque, like Iberian, it is a linguistic island, but a particularly frustrating one, because unlike Basque, the Etruscans are gone. There is no living community to consult, no native speakers whose intuitions might help decode the grammar. There are only fragments. Roughly 13,000 inscriptions survive, most of them brief funerary texts, names, and dedications. Scholars can read Etruscan in the sense that they can pronounce it and identify some grammatical patterns. They can decline nouns, recognize verb forms, and translate simple ritual formulas that recur with enough frequency across different sites to establish their meaning through repetition. But they still cannot fully translate most of it. The meaning remains locked behind a linguistic door that 2 centuries of dedicated scholarship has only partially pried open. Into this vacuum of certainty, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, offered an explanation. The Etruscans, he claimed, originated in Lydia, a kingdom in western Anatolia, the region of modern-day Turkey along the Aegean coast. According to Herodotus, a famine of catastrophic severity struck Lydia, and the Lydian king ordered half the population to emigrate. Under the leadership of his son Tyrrhenus, this group built ships, sailed west across the Mediterranean, and eventually settled in Italy, becoming the people the Greeks called Tyrrhenians and the Romans called Etruscans. The name Tyrrhenian Sea, the body of water along Italy's western coast, preserves this claimed connection to this day. For roughly 2,000 years, this account had no serious competition. Then, beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, classical scholars began to push back. The archaeological record in Etruria showed strong continuity with earlier Italian Bronze Age cultures, suggesting an indigenous development rather than a foreign migration. Pottery styles, settlement patterns, and burial customs all appeared to evolve gradually from local precursors rather than arriving suddenly from across the sea. Herodotus, scholars increasingly argued, was simply repeating an unreliable origin myth, the kind of explanatory folklore that ancient historians frequently recorded without verification. The ancient world was full of such tales. Kingdoms claiming descent from gods, cities claiming foundation by wandering heroes. By the mid-20th century, The dominant academic position had inverted entirely. The Etruscans were indigenous to Italy. The theory of Anatolian origin was a charming but discredited ancient legend, and Herodotus had been wrong. Then the genetics arrived. And the genetics did something that almost never happens in historical disputes this old. They sided with the ancient source against 2 centuries of modern, scholarly consensus. The first major genetic study to address Etruscan origins, published in 2004 by a team led by geneticist Guido Barbugiani, analyzed mitochondrial DNA extracted from Etruscan-era skeletal remains across multiple archaeological sites in Tuscany. The results showed genetic affinities that did not fit a purely indigenous Italian origin. The signal pointed eastward, toward Anatolia and the Near East, in patterns that were difficult to explain through standard models of European population continuity. The study was controversial. Ancient DNA extraction techniques in the early 2000s were less refined than they would later become, and contamination was a persistent concern. Critics argued the sample sizes were too small and the methodology too uncertain to overturn decades of archaeological consensus. But the finding did not go away, it deepened. A more comprehensive study published in 2013 in the journal PLOS ONI, again involving Barbugiani's research group, expanded the genetic analysis and compared ancient Etruscan samples with modern populations across Europe and Anatolia. The genetic signature in ancient Etruscan remains showed closer affinity to populations in the Near East and Anatolia than to other ancient European populations of the same era. The pattern was consistent enough, across enough independent samples, that it could no longer be dismissed as a methodological artifact. The most significant confirmation came in 2021, in a large-scale study published in Science Advances, conducted by an international team, including researchers from Harvard Medical School and the University of Florence. This study used whole genome sequencing, far more comprehensive than the mitochondrial-only analysis of earlier research, on 82 individuals spanning from the Iron Age through the Roman imperial period in central Italy. The results were nuanced in an important way that earlier headlines about Etruscan origins had oversimplified. Genetically, the ancient Etruscans were found to be remarkably similar to their Latin-speaking neighbors in central Italy, sharing a common genetic profile derived primarily from the same ancient European ancestral streams. There was no single, recent, large-scale Anatolian migration event of the kind a literal reading of the Tyrrhenus legend might suggest. But, and this is the detail that makes the story genuinely fascinating, rather than simply a vindication or refutation, the study also found something that earlier indigenous origin theories had not predicted. Buried within the broader European genetic profile of the Etruscan population was a distinct minor ancestry component connected to populations from the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia, present at levels too significant to be coincidental, but too modest to represent the kind of mass colonization event the Herodotus account describes in its most literal form. The genetic data suggested something more precise than either the old myth or the modern rejection of it. Not a sudden mass migration of half a Lydian kingdom in a single generation, but a real, measurable ancient connection between the populations of Western Anatolia and the ancestors of the Etruscans. A connection old enough and gradual enough to leave a genetic trace without leaving the kind of total population replacement that critics of Herodotus had assumed any such migration would require. In other words, Herodotus was not making it up. He was almost certainly recording a folk memory, however distorted by centuries of oral transmission, of a real ancient connection between Anatolia and the people who would become the Etruscans. He got the scale wrong. He got the dramatic narrative details wrong. There is no evidence of a single catastrophic famine or a single heroic migration led by a prince named Tyrrhenus. But the underlying claim, the one that 2 centuries of modern scholars confidently rejected as fantasy, was rooted in something genuinely real. A connection across the eastern Mediterranean that the genetics can now detect, even though the historical record never precisely described how or when it happened. It is a humbling reminder for any discipline that prides itself on rigor. Sometimes the oldest, least verifiable source turns out to be standing closer to the truth than the centuries of careful scholarship built to correct it. This matters beyond the narrow question of one ancient civilization's origin story. It is a case study in how oral tradition, even when wrong in its specific details, can preserve the memory of real population history across centuries in ways that purely textual or archaeological analysis sometimes misses entirely. Herodotus was writing roughly 1,000 years after the population movements his account describes would have needed to occur, relying on stories told to him by people whose own ancestors had carried this memory forward through dozens of generations. The details degraded. The narrative compressed itself into a single dramatic emigration story, the way oral histories tend to compress slow processes into single memorable events. But the core kernel, a real connection to Anatolia, survived the centuries of retelling intact enough for modern genetics to finally confirm it. There is a farmer living today in the Tuscan countryside, on land his family has worked for generations, whose genome carries a faint but measurable signal connecting him to populations that lived in Western Turkey 3,000 years ago. He has likely never read Herodotus. He almost certainly does not think of himself as anything other than Italian, rooted entirely in the soil of Tuscany. And yet the deepest layer of his ancestry carries the trace of a connection across the Mediterranean that an ancient Greek historian heard about, wrote down, was disbelieved for 2,000 years, and was finally vindicated by a science that did not exist when the claim was first written. He drinks wine from grapes grown on hillsides his Etruscan ancestors may have terraced. He walks past tombs his ancestors built, decorated with frescoes whose colors have survived 2,500 years underground, depicting banquets and dances whose full cultural meaning is still only partially understood. The Etruscans built the foundations Rome stood on, then disappeared into the empire they had helped create. Their language remains largely unread. Their cities are mostly buried beneath later construction. But their DNA survived, carried forward through the populations of central Italy across 2.5 millennia, preserving in its sequences a geography that no manuscript fully recorded and no historian fully believed until the evidence finally arrived. History is not written in books, it is written in genomes, and sometimes the oldest written account turns out to be closer to the truth than the scholars who spent 2 centuries trying to correct it.